Canadian men's national team picking up a 2-0 win over El Salvador. But I want to start in that first half because that was the worst first half of soccer that I watched in a long time. We got these nice notebooks at a World Cup media event in Vancouver a little while back, and both of us have been using those notebooks as our kind of Canadian soccer Bibles for the next year, and we'll bring those through the World Cup for our match coverage. But I had two notes by like the 35th minute, which doesn't usually happen. Usually there's a few more than that. But that game, especially the way it started, was painful to watch. And I think basically anybody that even saw the stats to that game, let alone watched it, can probably agree with that.
Yeah, well, anytime in CONCACAF you're setting a record for discipline or any of the sorts, you're usually you scratch your head and you say, okay, wow, that saying something. Granted, I guess it's saying something that so many games like this in the past have gone unpunished. So I guess shout out to VAR, especially on the Alistair Johnston red card moment that was drawn. I thought that was, I think that's something that maybe goes unpunished. Heck, you saw it at Copa America. I don't know what it is with Alistair Johnston's head that people just love to throw elbows at it, but whatever he's doing is working in that department. Although I'm sure his wife is just telling him, please, try to keep the flying elbows at a minimum. But yeah, 2 red cards for El Salvador in the first half, a Gold Cup record. Definitely not the record they would have hoped heading into the game where they needed a 5-goal win to potentially knock out Canada.
Yeah, I think it was 19 fouls within the first 20 minutes or so. And that 20 minutes wasn't even real 20 minutes because one of their players, I forget the name of, spent the entire, first 10 minutes of the game on the pitch and probably should have been taken off earlier, then continued, then gets a couple of red cards. Just absolutely absurd start to that one. You called it the Houston Hatchet in our rundown here. But Canada does prevail after a bit of disappointment at the end of the first half. Jonathan David, of course, missed a penalty kick at the end of the first half. His 7th miss in 37 attempts in all professional competitions, but his second in 3 attempts for Canada. But he does go on to score a good goal. Tajon Buchanan adds another. Canada goes on to win 2-0. They were dominant throughout. They had over 400 passes. El Salvador had 73 passes, 18 successful passes in the second half. It was a dominant showing in a lot of ways from Canada, but also not as dominant as you would want to see, considering that they played 2 men up for most of the game.
Yeah, I think that's twofold, and that actually ties nicely into a question we had from Oz Sweeney that I just wanted to add, because Oz Sweeney has a good point, as he always does. He said it was very concerning that, especially at 2-0, you kind of wondered, okay, the floodgates are open. Were they going to win 5-6-0, get a bit of a confidence booster? But then after that point, there was kind of no killer instinct or off-ball movement, as he put. But then on the flip side, this was such a strange game for Canada because for whatever reason, El Salvador had very little intention of playing football, I guess, for a lack of a better word, where they just came in and it was once that first clothesline went in on Tajon Buchanan. Heck, it was even before that when that first standing leg tackle on Jacob Schaffelberg right in front of the bench went in. It was clear that it was going to be a very physical game. So for Canada, it's a bit of a mixed bag because on one hand, you'd want to see them really run the gauntlet here, really get a 5 or 6-0 win on one hand. On the other hand, no suspensions, no injuries, you get a win. It's also one of those where sometimes in tournament football, you almost have to think about the bigger picture. And I do like on one hand that Canada didn't overexert themselves and that it almost benefited them. The second half, they were just walking around because that's all they needed to do. Why waste energy on a game that already was done and dusted? So a bit of a mixed one, like you say, because I think you're always hungry for a bigger performance, but at the same time, Canada did show some good maturity in a lot of ways.
And it was something that Jesse Marsch kind of expected as well. And he alluded to it in his Matchday -1 press conference when he was asked by an El Salvador reporter what he sees in the El Salvador team. And he said the word Selbstverständlichkeit, which in German means to be happy with oneself and confident in oneself. And I think it's one of those words, and you have these words in French. I, of course, don't speak another language, but that means a lot more than the English translation. And I think you could have seen that through the way that El Salvador played in the game that Canada got themselves into, because that was not the game that I think Jesse Marsch would have hoped for in his return to the bench.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the El Salvador team, they've got a strong identity in the sense that they love their shirt. They have this certain passion. Granted, I wasn't fully expecting to see that because I still think of the Hugo Perez El Salvador. That might have been the best El Salvador because they had a good combination of like being good on the ball, a bit more dangerous, but still having that grit. And it felt like this version of the team just had the grit and maybe not any of the ball. Granted, Canada is also a lot better than it was 3 years ago, so it's harder for teams like El Salvador to impose themselves in a game in a way like this. So yeah, I think for Canada, it was something they expected, but I think again, what it showed over the last year is the respect they continue to get. Mexico gave them a lot of respect with how they attacked them. Curacao gave them a lot of respect. El Salvador gave them a lot of respect, and that's a credit to Canada, but also those bring challenges as we're starting to learn.
And Jesse Marshall also mentioned in his post-game match availability that they were able to get players out of the lineup and get a little bit more rest. It wasn't necessarily a taxing game physically, even though it was a violent affair between these two teams. But Canada, you mentioned there's no suspensions. You mentioned there's no injuries. New injuries, of course, Jonathan Osorio and Ali Ahmed out of the roster, and it doesn't look like Stefan Eustaquio is going to join the team either. But they managed to really manage their minutes in this one and manage their physical load. How important is that going into the knockout phase?
Yeah, it's crucial, especially with the Stefan Eustaquio news kind of hanging over. He was spotted while he traveled with the team back to Portugal, which isn't the greatest of signs. Of course, Christian Jack reporting on the One Soccer TSN broadcast that it's not, looking ideal. Jesse Marsh was supposed to provide an update. Then there's a bit of a snafu from the CONCACAF Zoom providing the wrong link. So, no one in the building asked him about Eustaquio's status because it was mostly, a bunch of local journalists and some El Salvador journalists. So that's a huge one that's hanging over. Yeah. You're going to need who's available, who's there. And it was good that, you escaped with no injuries. One thing I loved is minute 57. As soon as it was the 2-0, you see Jonathan David come off, keep him fresh, keep him at his best. Alistair Johnston, you keep him. Derek Cornelius, who just came back from injury, looked great. You're going to need him going forward. So I think it was good to see Canada manage that because it's a long tournament. They said it at Copa America. They ran out of gas. Well, you don't want to run out of gas because Guatemala, you get past Guatemala, you could potentially have the U.S., you get past the U.S., you could potentially have Mexico. You're going to need all hands on deck. So it's good to see Canada protect their players.
Yeah, it definitely would have been nice to be able to ask Jesse Marsh the Stefan Eustaquio question after the match, but instead we got questions about El Salvador's lineup decisions, which, not of much use to us in Canada or, an El Salvador team that is going home after a pretty ugly group stage. And what a fall for the footballing style and standard of their country as well, after being one of the better teams in CONCACAF, along with Honduras, for a little while, and both these teams not looking very good against the Canadian men's national team in the group stage. But on the theme of Canada not really imposing themselves against this El Salvador side, despite being 2 men up, they continued to struggle to break down a low block. And it was about as low a block as you could possibly imagine. It was 2 banks of 4 and 1 forward for that El Salvador team. They did not have much going for them. And it was just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for the Canadian midfield. And they just couldn't really find something until Nico Seeger played through Tejan Buchanan. It wasn't the prettiest game, especially near the end. El Salvador seemingly were defending a 2-0 lead, which I guess you can kind of do when you're with 9 players. But it wasn't a very entertaining affair. But good on Canada to be able to maintain possession. They ended up with 80% possession in this one.
Yeah, good of a training exercise. But no, it's a good question. Matt Dirks had that question as well, saying this team continues to struggle to break down low blocks. Tonight was the shorthanded block, which is also true, right? 9. You do hope, again, like we said earlier, that Canada would maybe get a bit more. And it's something that it's a question where he said, should Canada be concerned when playing stiffer competition at the World Cup? That's the point I'm watching, because World Cup teams are smart. World Cup teams are going to see that Canada has had this struggle against low blocks and think, okay, maybe you let them have the ball a bit. Don't let their press be effective. Sit back. And I continue to worry that the more and more evidence there is of Canada struggling in those situations, the more they're going to see it. I guess the good news is this is free practice. We'll get into our Guatemala preview. I expect a very similar game in terms of not hatcheting, but at least in terms of defensive setup. So yeah, it's something to watch, because I think with Canada, what stood out versus El Salvador, they struggled to get much going out wide. in the sense of overloads against the low block. Like Tajon Buchanan and Jacob Schaffelberg, I thought had good games, but they didn't get as much support from the fullbacks, whereas against Honduras, the wingers did, and that made a big difference. And then centrally, Promise David had, I think it was something like 18 touches, 8 touches, something ridiculously low like that. Because El Salvador did a great job of closing him down. Jonathan David, they tried to keep away. So for Canada, it shows, okay, what do you do in a situation like that? What I liked about both of their goals, they kind of came from that half space between the fullback and center back both times. David drifting out the first time, Tajon Buchanan drifting in the second time. That's something I want to see more of, because I think with Canada at times they've been a bit predictable with their crossing. They want to get it wide and whip in a ball. Great. Well, when you're averaging around 15% cross completion this Gold Cup like they are, you're going to need some different solutions. And I think against Honduras, they did a good job of packing the overloads or the half space and the overloads. Tani Oluwase's goal was from the half space. Nico Seeger's goal was from the half space. And they did that against El Salvador. Let's see more of that. Because I think when you attack those spaces, it's great because it either drags the fullbacks in or it drags the center backs out. And that just opens up more space. And I think Canada, that's the sort of movements they need, where instead of being so predictable with wanting crosses and the like, Ben.
I think you can even take a step back from that and look at the assists that were provided as well, because Canada was up against that low block. And even if you put 8 players behind the ball when a team is defending at full strength, that's still a very difficult thing to break down. And that could happen at the World Cup against these better teams. But Canada found a way through Matthew Choinière and Nico Seeger to thread a ball through. And those spaces will arise. Miscommunications do happen even against the best teams. And if you have a player that can pick out those passes, and of course we know Canada has a striker that can make the run to get on those passes, and Jonathan David, that's a quality that Canada hasn't necessarily had before, other than Stefan Eustáquio. And we saw 2 players do that and punish against El Salvador. How important is that to have players that can really thread those passes?
It's huge. It's huge because, again, you need guys who will break lines as well when you're against low blocks, because it doesn't matter if you have all this off-ball movement if you don't have the guys who can see those passes. And I thought that was really encouraging. That Choinière ball in the first one was sublime. That's how it really felt. And that's where Jonathan David is going to be so crucial, is if, again, this is his strength. He's not going to be a guy who's up against the center back trying to elbow him, muscle him down. That was Promise David's job. That's going to be Tani Oluwase's job. If it's Kyle Larin and Jonathan David, that's Kyle Larin's job. With David playing a bit as a free role, you want to see him find those spaces, because again, when you're breaking down low blocks, the principles you need to break them down are movement to draw guys out of position, quick passing, because like you mentioned, spaces are going to open up here and there. It's like a whack-a-mole. It's going to open up for a second. You got to swing quick. You got to pounce. And I think having the midfielders to do that also makes a big difference.